G'day, you're watching Miss Hobbs Teaches Biology, and today we're going to be doing our part 2 video of the reproductive system. Welcome back to another episode of Miss Hobbs Teaches. My name's Miss Hobbs. I'm a Victorian science, STEM, agriculture and business teacher, and all of my videos are Victorian curriculum aligned. Now, in part 1 of this series, we talked about sexual reproduction in both plants and animals. Be sure to check that one out. And we are now moving today into part 2, talking about asexual reproduction in both plants and animals. Okay, so let's get into it. So the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction is sexual reproduction, it sees your male and your female gametes combined together through the process of meiosis. But in asexual reproduction, we see reproduction from just one individual. Okay, so we don't see that combination of the two different male and female gametes. So basically what this means is that in asexual reproduction, only one parent is required to produce an offspring. But in sexual reproduction, we need two parents required to produce an offspring. So that sexual reproduction, it's characterized by that male and female gamete fusing together to form a new organism. But because we don't have male or female gametes in this, we don't see this fusing to form the new organism. So what this means is that asexual reproduction is basically cloning. It's making genetically identical copies of itself to reproduce. Now, plants can produce asexually, so they can produce clones of themselves through producing spores, runners, bulbs, or stem tubers. So this asexual reproduction in plants can occur through 3 ways. They can either produce runners, and runners are stems which grow along the ground. Now, these runners, they grow their stems along the ground and they put their roots down at different places. So maybe you've noticed this, sometimes you get a tree and you might say, oh, that one has like the couple suckers have shot up. You've got a big tree and then you have a couple little trees not too far away. Well, those little trees are clones of the big tree and they're produced through what we call runners. So those little trees were produced through asexual reproduction. They're not different to our big tree. They're the exact same. The second way that our plants can reproduce asexually is through bulbs, okay? Now, the bulb is the rounded part of the plant which is under the ground, and it contains a shoot of a new plant. So these bulbs, this is how onions reproduce, and tulips, daffodils, all of those produce bulbs, and those bulbs allow for asexual reproduction. So what that means is that you could take that bulb, dig that up and put that anywhere and it'd be the exact same. And the last way that we see our plants produce asexually is through stem tubers. Now, when you see about how a potato grows, you plant your main potato and it shoots its flower from there. And down at its roots, it actually produces more and more potatoes, because when you pull a potato plant, there's lots and lots of potatoes. Well, potatoes, right, and how they produce down there, that's an example of Stemtuber reproduction, and that is asexual. So in all of these 3 methods, the stem tubers, the bulbs, and the runners, the plants that we get produced, right, they are the exact same as the parent plant, okay? So there was no meiosis with this. There was no recombination of the gametes, okay? There was no pollen or ovum. There was no egg and sperm, right, when we were talking about that. These are simply clones. Now, another way that plants can reproduce asexually is through dropping spores. Now, dropping spores might sound a little bit like when a plant goes to seed and it drops its seed, but it's a little bit different because our spores are actually clones of our parent plant, okay? And these spores are produced in mushrooms, okay? So if you take a look underneath the side of a mushroom, you would see these what we call gills, okay? They're underneath. Now, what these gills do is they drop spores into the ground, and our spores then shoot and form new mushrooms. Those new mushrooms are exactly the same as the parent mushroom. So that's asexual reproduction. So lots of other organisms also reproduce by asexual reproduction. We've got different things like bacteria, yeast, and even some animals reproduce by this technique. So we know that in bacteria, they produce or reproduce by asexual reproduction through the technique called binary fission. Now, binary fission was a little bit like mitosis if you think back. And basically what happens is our cell has its free DNA, and its DNA is in a circle. It multiplies its DNA, and then it splits in half and has two brand new cells that are exactly the same. So that is called binary fission, and that is an asexual method of reproduction. The reason it's asexual is because we didn't have the combination of gametes or genetic information. Now, yeast, on the other hand, it is able to asexually reproduce through this technique called budding. Now, budding is when there is a small growth that appears on the bacteria or the animal, and that small growth then breaks off. And that forms two individuals. And this is how yeast is able to reproduce asexually. But it's also how this small freshwater organism called Hydra is able to reproduce. It uses this budding technique where some of its original self breaks off, forming a brand new self. But that brand new self or organism that's produced is exactly the same genetically as the parent, okay? Because it's a clone. There's no new genetic information which is added. Another process which we see is called fragmentation. And in fragmentation, what happens is part of the initial organism can be broken off. This broken off organism is then able to grow the other half of itself, which is missing, back. And as a matter of fact, this is how starfishes are able to reproduce. They reproduce through this fragmentation. So when part of them breaks off, they're able to grow back that part that's broken off. And then the part that actually broke off, it's able to grow back or grow the rest of it, which is pretty amazing. And obviously we don't see any new genetic information brought in here. So that's asexual reproduction. Moving into some more complicated animals, because, bacteria, yeast, and, even starfish and the Hydra, they're not very complex. That's pretty simple. Moving into something that's a bit more complicated is called Parthenogenesis, okay? And what this means is that an egg is able to develop into an embryo without the sperm. Because remember how we talked about male and female gametes? Yeah, well, your female gamete, the egg, develops without the male gamete, which is crazy, right? But also very, very cool. Now, some of the animals that are able to reproduce using this parthenogenesis are bees, ants, wasps, crayfish, and even it's known or been known to occur that when the males aren't present, Komodo dragons and geckos have also been able to reproduce by this mechanism. So asexual reproduction can be really good because it's going to allow for rapid growth and development. And you only need one parent, so there's no need for a mate. It's also really good because it doesn't require any mobility, and we don't have any of those issues that we talked about regarding internal and external fertilization. There is, however, some disadvantages. Remember how I started off the last video talking about, why don't we have just lots and lots of Miss Hobbses? Well, that's the thing. When we use asexual reproduction, we see no genetic variation, and that's definitely a negative. Again, your species might only be suited to one habitat, which isn't ideal. Thirdly, if there is a disease, it's going to affect all of the individuals within a population, which means you could be facing a mass extinction event. So whilst there are pros, we also see cons to asexual reproduction. So if we compare what we've covered in these last 2 episodes, in sexual reproduction, we require 2 gametes to form a new organism. Those 2 gametes being pollen and the ovum in plants and egg and sperm in our animals. In asexual reproduction, we only require 1 parent, okay? And usually this will be the female, okay? But in some of them, obviously with budding and fragmentation, like we talked about the starfish, doesn't matter. They don't have a sex. With our sexual reproduction, we see that our sperm or our pollen is able to fertilize our female gamete, whereas in asexual reproduction, we have a single organism which is able to make an exact copy of itself. So it's producing a clone. It's not producing something which is genetically identical. And that brings me to our next point. In sexual reproduction, your offspring are different from their parents and we see genetic diversity. But in asexual reproduction, we don't see genetic diversity and the offspring is exactly the same. It's a clone, which is pretty cool. And lastly, asexual reproduction can be really advantageous as it does provide genetic variation, but it is time consuming. Whereas asexual reproduction is fast, it's easy, and there's no genetic variation. So obviously no genetic variation can be a downside, but when we look at something like starfish, despite reproducing by asexual reproduction through our fragmentation, they have been around for a very, very long time and will still be to come. Thanks for watching this episode of Miss Hobbs Teaches. I hope you found it helpful. If you thought this video was good, make sure you give it a thumbs up. You can also subscribe and turn the notification bell on. If you would like clarification on any topic, don't forget to comment down below. Thanks for watching.